By the third knock, Rowan was already in his boots, because nobody came to a gate in that kind of cold unless something had gone wrong beyond mending. When he opened the door, wind knifed through the dark and filled the cabin with loose powder snow, and out by the drifted fence a mule stood with its head hanging low in the traces, while two children had been tied upright on a grain sled so they would not topple into the ruts and freeze there. The smaller one blinked once and failed to raise a hand. Caleb did not ask whose they were. He crossed the yard in snow up to his knees, broke the rope with fingers gone numb at once, tucked one child under each arm, and carried both inside without a word. He set them by the stove, then crouched on his haunches in front of them and worked like a man trying to coax life back into coals. Their coats were crusted white to the shoulders. The boy had a split lip and smelled of mule sweat and cold wool. The girl's lashes had iced together. Caleb stripped off his own scarf and wrapped it around both their hands at once, rubbing hard enough to bring pain before warmth. When the boy finally made a sound, it was not a cry but a dry little cough that rattled like gravel in a tin pan. The note was pinned inside the girl's coat with a bent sewing needle. Caleb had to hold it close to the lamp because his hands were shaking more than the paper was. "If I do not make it, take Lucy and Ben. Martin said you are the one man in Juniper Bend who still means a thing when he says it. Harlan Pike will come for the land before he comes for the children, but he will come for both. The paper is where a child would keep it." I kept walking as long as I could. No name at the bottom, only a smear where the ink had run and the corner of the page stiff with frozen blood. The wind pushed at the cabin walls with the flat-palmed insistence of a drunk refused entry. Caleb got broth going, broke stale biscuits into it, and fed the children with the handle end of a spoon because the girl was too cold to hold one. When the boy saw the forge through the open inner door and the iron glowing there in the half-dark, he looked not afraid but puzzled, as if this house did not match the story he had been told about the man in it. That was fair. There had been years now when Caleb's own house had not matched any human use. It had been a place for sleeping, for work, for waiting out weather, and not much else. And before the fire gets any lower and this story carries us farther into the snow, tell me where you're listening from tonight. A kitchen in Iowa, a back room in Perth, a porch in Kentucky, a flat in Leeds, some place where the day is finally loosening its grip. It does a heart good to know who's sitting close when a hard story begins. The girl swallowed 2 spoons of broth, then looked up at him with eyes too large for her face. "Ma said red door," she whispered. Caleb glanced at the door, more brown than red by now where the paint had weathered away. "Used to be. She said you don't talk much." "That's also true." The boy reached inside his coat and brought out a small wooden horse with one leg worn smooth from his thumb. "She said if we got here, we stay by the stove and don't let the rabbit go." "The rabbit?" Lucy turned her head toward the sled blanket Caleb had dropped by the threshold. Something soft had fallen from it. A rag rabbit, gray once and now nearly the color of dishwater, lay on its side near the door, one button eye missing. Caleb picked it up and set it beside her. She caught it to her chest with both hands and closed her eyes. He knew Martin Danner. Knew had become too broad a word for the dead, but he had known him once. Martin had shod horses under Caleb 2 winters when he was barely 20, all elbows and eagerness, with a laugh that arrived before the joke did. Then he'd married and taken a patch of creek land west of Pike's Range, and Caleb had seen him only at branding time and once in town buying lamp oil. Martin had died beneath a log wagon the previous spring. That much everybody knew. Caleb had not heard much after. Men said Widow Danner was struggling. Men said many things from warm store counters. The children ate until the boys had nodded. Caleb found 2 old quilts in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, quilts his wife May had sewn from feed sacks and faded church dresses, and he hesitated with one spread open in his hands. He had not taken them out in 3 years. Then the girl's teeth chattered against the rim of the cup, and he wrapped them together in May's small, even stitches as if the decision had never belonged to him in the first place. There was a bruise on the inside of Lucy's wrist, thumb-shaped and ugly dark against skin gone pale with cold. Caleb saw it when he tucked the blanket close under her chin. He saw, too, that the boy had a patch torn from his sleeve where fingers had grabbed and missed. Nothing in the note said chaste. It did not need to. He saddled his roan with the sky still dark, leaving the children asleep on a pallet by the stove and a bucket of kindling close enough the boy could reach it if he woke first. He rode to town with snow stinging his cheeks raw and fetched Doctor Ada Greer from behind the surgery where she was splitting frozen water in the horse trough with the butt of a hatchet. She looked at the set of his mouth, said only, "How many?" and had her bag in her hand before he answered. She sat backward in the wagon on the way out, one gloved hand braced against the seat, the other holding the medicine case between her boots. Ada had the sort of face cold sharpened rather than diminished, clean planes and steady eyes and a mouth that seemed made more for truth than comfort. Folks in Juniper Bend called her difficult when they meant she did not flatter them. They called her brave when they felt guilty that they were relieved someone else had done what they would not. When they reached the cabin, she went straight to the children, laid 2 fingers at each throat, then held the boy's face between her hands and turned it toward the light. "This one's been struck," she said. "Not hard enough to break. Hard enough to teach fear." She peeled back Lucy's sleeve, saw the bruise Caleb had seen, and something in her expression turned flint hard. And their mother? Not here. Ada looked once at the note on the table, then at the snow still blowing under the door. If she walked that far with them, she walked beyond reason. "You'd best look now." Caleb found Elspeth Danner half a mile from his gate, down where the cottonwoods bent over the creek and the wind had packed drifts between the trunks like walls. She had crawled the last yards, judging by the furrows in the snow. One boot was gone. Her right temple was matted black. One hand was stretched toward the road, as if she had meant to rise again and failed at it. Caleb stood over her a long moment while the horse shifted beneath him and steam rolled from its flanks into the hard white air. There were tracks besides hers. 3 mounted riders had circled once, close enough to see her and not close enough to help. One horse carried Pike's broken bar brand on its near hip. When Caleb knelt, the cold went through his trousers to the bone. He closed Elspeth's eyes with his thumb and lifted her as gently as he had lifted the children. But the weight of the dead was its own kind of truth, undeniable and complete. By the time he laid her in the wagon beside a folded tarp, his world had narrowed to 3 facts he could not step around. The children had no one. Harlan Pike had reached for something he did not own. And if Caleb Rowan put those 2 children back out into that cold world now, the failure would be his in a way that would outlive him. By afternoon, the news had crossed Juniper Bend the way smoke crossed a wash on still days, low and fast, and impossible to gather back in. Elspeth lay in the back room of the church under a clean sheet. Lucy slept in Caleb's bed with fever coming on, and Ben had taken up silent guard on a stool beside her, Rabbit in his lap, the wooden horse in one fist. Ada moved through the cabin with the competence of someone who had long ago given up waiting to be invited to do what needed doing. She boiled linens. She dosed willow bark. She opened Caleb's flour bin, judged it nearly empty, and sent a neighbor boy back to town with a list pinned to his shirt front. By dusk, Harlan Pike came himself. He did not knock the way desperate people did. He lifted the latch and stepped in on the strength of his own standing, taking off his hat with that measured courtesy powerful men use when they expect courtesy to be mistaken for decency. He was broad through the shoulders and carried 60 years as if they were still there to serve him. Snow clung to his coat collar in neat white beads. He looked first at Ada, because men like him always like to decide how much trouble a woman might be, and then he looked at Caleb. "Bad business," he said. "About Elspeth." Caleb kept one hand on the back of the chair where Ben Saturday, "So I hear." Pike's gaze slid to the children. Lucy had woken and gone still as a field mouse at the sight of a hawk's shadow. Ben tucked the rabbit behind him. "I came because there's the practical matter," Pike said. "The widow owed on feed, seed, and winter credit. The place is in arrears. Those children can't stay here, Caleb. They need proper shelter, proper supervision. County will send them to the home in Helena. Safer than this." The words proper and safer landed in the room like spoons set down too carefully. Ada clicked shut the brass clasp on her medicine bag. A place becomes safer the moment certain men stop visiting it. Pike smiled at her, though his eyes did not change. "Dr. Greer. Mr. Pike." He turned back to Caleb. "I'll make it easy. I'll see them delivered proper. I'll settle the matter of the Danner debt and leave you out of it." Ben made a small sound. Not a word. Something older than words. Caleb felt it through the chair back into his palm. "What matter of the debt?" Caleb asked. Pike spread his gloves over the stove rail to dry. "The common sort. Paper, signatures, obligations. Hard things for children to understand." "Maybe," Caleb said. Maybe not. Pike's face sharpened by a degree. You're alone out here. You work all day at the forge. You've no wife, no housekeeper, no kin under your roof. Let the county do what county is for. It would have been easy then. Easy in the way a rotten board gives underweight. Caleb could have nodded, could have told himself children healed better among women and schools and regular suppers. He could have handed the note over, turned the stove down, and gone back to the clean, familiar misery of one plate and one cup on his table. Easy had a strong pull when a man had been living alone with his failures long enough. He looked at Lucy's bruised wrist. He looked at the boy's fist clenched wide around that ridiculous gray rabbit. Then he looked at Pike, who had ridden past a dying woman in the snow and come not for the dead or the children, but for what paper they carried. They stay, Caleb said. Pike held still so long the stove gave 2 sharp ticks from the settling heat. You mean until arrangements are made? I mean they stay. The rancher's expression went smooth again, which was worse than anger. Then arrangements will be made faster than I'd planned. After he left, the cabin seemed warmer for lack of him and colder for what remained. Ada stood at the window until the sound of Pike's horse faded down the track. He'll petition the probate judge by morning, she said. He chairs the school board, bankrolls half the hay in this valley, and the judge fishes his pond every August. He'll say you're unfit, too solitary, too indebted, too damaged. Some of it even true. Caleb moved to the shelf and took down his account book. How much bond? More than you have in that tin box under the flour sack. He glanced at her. You looked. I always look where people hide cash. Dying has a way of revealing poor storage habits. The corner of his mouth moved before he could stop it. Ben, who had been watching him as if decoding an animal, saw it and blinked in surprise. Ada crossed to Lucy and adjusted the blanket at her chin. I'm not telling you to surrender them. I'm telling you to understand the price. He said nothing for a moment. Outside, a gust scraped the bare lilac branches along the wall with the dry sound of bones in a drawer. Martin once worked my forge, he said. Burned his hand on a rasp and didn't cuss because he thought I'd dismiss him if he did. Stayed 3 hours after close to finish a team with that hand wrapped in wet burlap. If he sent them here, I'll not let Pike choose what happens next. Ada took the girl's wrist lightly and counted under her breath. Then you'll need affidavits. You'll need the note, the body examined, and someone besides yourself saying these children are better here than in a town wagon headed east. You? She hesitated. Only a flicker, but he saw it. Ada Greer did not hesitate over blood or fever or broken limbs. She did hesitate around children for reasons everybody in Juniper Bend pretended not to know and everybody knew anyway. She had lost a boy 12 years ago while riding 30 miles through sleet to deliver another woman's baby, and the fact that the story changed depending on who told it had never made it less cruel. Lucy woke coughing. Ada bent at once, slid an arm behind her shoulders, and waited until the spasm passed. The child leaned against her without permission, too tired to remember caution. Ada looked over Lucy's head at Caleb. Yes, she said at last. Me. The days that followed moved with the strange packed urgency of deep winter, when every small practical thing became large enough to alter a life. Caleb set a cot up by the stove for Ben because the boy would not sleep apart from Lucy. He found an old shawl of maize and pinned it across the window crack where the wind came through. He hammered tiny cleats from scrap iron and nailed them to the soles of the children's boots so they could walk on the packed yard without pitching hard. He burned the oats too sweet the first morning and not enough the next. He learned Lucy hated onions, and Ben would eat anything if no one watched him do it. What surprised him was not the work. Work had always made sense. It was the listening that exhausted him. Children made small sounds all day long, sounds a solitary house had long since forgotten. The drag of a wooden horse over a floorboard groove, the wet catch before tears, the muttered game talk under a blanket tent, the little breath Lucy made through her teeth when a fever dream had not quite let go. By the third evening, Caleb knew the difference between the silence of sleep and the silence of fear. Town brought itself to his door in installments. Mrs. Nettle from the mercantile arrived with stockings she pretended had been ordered months ago and forgot to collect payment for. Reverend Sloane came to pray over Elspeth's burial and left without offering an opinion, which in Juniper Bend counted as a kindness. Young Deputy Corbin Price rode out with county papers, and kept pulling at his left ear every time Ben looked at him, because the child's stare made a liar of whatever official calm the man had practiced. Ada came twice a day, sometimes 3 times. She always knocked, though by the second morning the children had begun calling through the door before Caleb reached it. She checked Lucy's chest, changed the dressing on Ben's lip, and once found Caleb in the wash shed staring at a line of tiny socks he had tried and failed to wring properly. "Give me those," she said. He handed them over. "You can set a horse on a cracked hoof, but will defeats you?" "Seems so." She worked the water out with deft hard twists. "Martin told me once you could tell which shoe a horse had thrown by the sound it made turning into town." Caleb leaned against the post. "Most men hear noise. You listen long enough, you hear weight." Ada looked at him then, really looked, and something gentled in her face. She bent to the basin, wrung the last sock, and said, almost as if the words had slipped out on their own, "Children don't ask for easy. They ask for steady." He felt that one land in him deeper than he liked. Harlan Pike set his pressure with a rancher's patience. Caleb's account at the mercantile was closed by polite message. A team contract for the mining road vanished. The bank note on Caleb's forge, one he had been paying on regular as sunrise, was called in full within 10 days unless alternate security could be shown. Folks who owed Pike hay or water quit bringing their horses to Rowan's shop and said it was because roads were poor. Then one dark morning someone cut the trace lines on Caleb's wagon and left them draped over the fence like a warning too cheap to spend words on. Caleb filed for temporary guardianship anyway. He did it in the county room under the barber shop where the ink always smelled faintly of vinegar and old dust. He signed his name. Ada signed as physician witness. Mrs. Nettle surprised them both by signing as to the children's present condition and conduct. Corbin Price watched from the stove with his thumb hooked under his belt and said nothing until Caleb had blotted the page. Pike's petition says those children were promised into his care if the widow failed, the deputy muttered. "He's lying," Ada said. Corbin glanced at the ceiling as if truth might be nailed there. "Might be. Still leaves the hearing Saturday." Saturday was 3 days away. The weather was turning again. The sky outside had that pale hard shine that meant the next snow was gathering itself beyond the ridge. That evening, after Lucy had finally eaten a whole bowl, and Ben had let Caleb help whittle a new peg for the wooden horse's leg, the cabin settled into a hush, so complete the pop of resin in the stove sounded like knuckles cracking. Caleb sat at the table with the notes spread before him and the lamp turned low. The line about the paper would not leave him. The paper is where a child would keep it. He had searched coat linings, mitten hems, the sled blanket, the mule harness roll. Nothing. "What was your ma carrying when she left?" he asked softly. Ben looked wary at the question, not from disobedience, but from the way some children learn that adults asking after objects are rarely asking only after objects. Lucy rubbed the rabbit's ear between finger and thumb. "A pie tin," Lucy said. "Then not a pie tin. She left it behind." "A satchel," Ben said. "Brown one. Wade took it." "Wade Tully?" Caleb asked. The boy nodded once. Ada was standing by the stove, heating water to wash her hands. "Pike's foreman." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Did he take anything else?" Ben shook his head. He grabbed Ma's arm. She bit him. "Did she say why she was coming here?" Lucy pressed her face to the rabbit. "Said a man can live alone a long time and still be better than a town full of folks." Ada's eyes flicked up at that. Caleb said nothing. Outside the first flakes had begun, thin and dry, skating past the window like ash. "Maybe you know the kind of hour I mean, when a house is warm enough to make you believe warmth can hold, and yet every sound outside tells you the world has not agreed. If you'd been in that room then, with the note on the table and the snow beginning again and the bank giving a man 10 days to choose between his livelihood and 2 children who had just learned his floorboards, what would you have held on to first? Your roof, your pride, or the frightened thing that had started feeling like duty so fast it was almost love? Caleb made that choice before dawn without speech or ceremony. He hitched the wagon to ride out to Willow Flat as soon as the light came gray enough to travel, meaning to search the Danner cabin before Pike's men did. He thought he had risen quietly. He was wrong. By the time he pulled on his coat, Ben stood in the doorway holding his boot with one hand and the rabbit in the other. "You stay," Caleb said. Ben jutted his chin. "It's bad roads. We know where Ma hid things." Ada, who had not been meant to stay the night, and had done so anyway after Lucy's cough turned rough, came from the stove tying back her hair. Then perhaps one of us ought to listen when a child says he knows something. Caleb looked from one to the other and felt the world narrowing again around the hard path. Taking the children would be dangerous. Leaving them with Pike's hearing 3 days away and his men already asking questions would be its own kind of danger. "You both ride in the wagon," he said. "You do not step out unless I tell you." They reached Willow Flat, near midday, under a sky the color of old pewter. The Danner place sat low beside the creek, half buried in drift lines, its chimney leaning, one shutter torn loose and tapping the wall in the wind. Tracks already marked the yard. Horse tracks, boot prints, fresh enough that snow had not yet softened the edges. Caleb saw the small change in Ben's face before he saw anything else. The boy looked not surprised, but betrayed. He pulled the team up short. "Stay here." Lucy's hand closed on the rabbit. Ada was already out of the wagon before he could repeat himself, doctor's bag in one hand, skirts gathered in the other. Caleb took the shotgun from under the seat more out of habit than intent and moved toward the cabin with the measured, careful speed of a man approaching a horse he does not wish to spook. The door stood open. Inside, drawers had been ripped and bedding slashed. Flour dust streaked the floor where someone had split the sack open with a knife. Wade Tully was on one knee by the cold hearth, swearing under his breath as he pulled stones loose from the chimney base. He looked up at the scrape of Caleb's boot and froze. "Too late," Wade said, breathing hard. He had a crescent bite scar along the meat of his left hand. "For what?" Caleb asked. Wade's gaze slid to the wagon outside, then back. "Should have stayed out of this." Ben's voice came sharp from the doorway behind Caleb. "He hit Ma." Caleb half turned. The child had disobeyed and come in. Lucy stood clutching Ada's hand, both of them framed in the gray doorlight. Wade lurched up. "Get them out." "Why?" Ada asked. Wade's eyes found the rabbit in Lucy's arms, and in that instant the room changed. Caleb saw it. Ada saw it. Even Lucy saw enough to pull the toy tighter to her chest. Wade moved. Fast. Not toward Caleb. Toward the girl. Caleb caught him by the coat and drove him sideways into the table. The table split with a flat crack. Lucy screamed. Ben grabbed the poker from beside the stove and swung with both hands. It struck Wade's shoulder, not hard enough to stop a man, but hard enough to turn him just as the oil lamp pitched off the mantel and shattered on the floorboards. Fire ran at once. Thin blue at first, then orange along the oil, then up the torn curtain and into the dry straw tick by the wall. Ada shoved Lucy toward the door. Ben stumbled after her. Smoke bunched low and black beneath the rafters. Wade fell under the broken table, one leg pinned at a wicked angle, cursing now with the bright, useless fury of a trapped man. Caleb snatched the rabbit from where it had dropped near the hearth and threw it toward Ada. Out. She caught it against her coat and vanished into the blowing white. Caleb hauled Ben by the collar and shoved him through the door into the snow. Then he turned back. Wade had dragged half free, but a burning beam from the shelf collapse had come down across his back. The easy choice sat plain as scripture. Leave him. Take the children. Let Pike lose a foreman to the consequence of his own hunting. For one hot second Caleb saw how simple a bad man's death could look from a doorway. Then he went back in. The beam burned through his gloves before he got a grip. Pain went white and clean all the way to his elbows. He grunted, shifted, lifted higher, and Wade rolled clear with a shout. Caleb got him under the arms and dragged him across the floor while sparks burst around them and the roof began to spit cinders. Outside, the cold hit the burns on his hands like salt on fresh-cut meat. He fell to one knee in the snow with Wade half on top of him and could not feel his fingers at all. Ada had Lucy wrapped in a blanket from the wagon. Ben stood rigid, face blackened with soot, the poker still in his hand like he meant to challenge the whole valley. The rabbit lay in the snow at Ada's boots. Something stiff showed through a tear in its seam where the fire had licked the cloth open. Ada crouched and drew it out carefully. Not stuffing. Oiled paper, rolled tight, and wrapped in waxed thread. Wade saw it and closed his eyes. Caleb could not uncurl his hands. Open it. Ada slit the thread with her lancet. Inside were 2 folded papers, smoke-stained but whole. The first was the Danner patent receipt bearing the federal seal and county record stamp for Willow Flat, issued in Martin Danner's name, with survivorship noted to lawful heirs. The second was a store ledger receipt signed by Harlan Pike's own clerk 6 months earlier, showing Elspeth Danner had paid the very winter account Pike was now using to claim her land. Good God, Ada said. Wade spat blood into the snow. He told me fetch the toy. Said the widow was too simple to hide it clever. And when she ran? Ada asked. Wade looked at the fire eating through the cabin roof. He said scare her. Bring her back. Didn't say leave her in the weather. Didn't say help her, neither. Horsemen came through the snowfall before anyone could speak again. Corbin Price in front, Pike behind him, 2 ranch hands at their heels. Pike reined in hard at the sight of the burning cabin. The children, Wade in the snow, and Caleb bent over his own ruined hands. For the first time since Caleb had known him, Harlan Pike looked surprised. Corbin swung down. What happened here? Wade made to speak, then saw Pike and stopped like a door had been shut inside him. Pike's voice came smooth and careful. I might ask the same. I feared Rowan would stir trouble. Looks like I feared right. Ada rose with the papers in one hand and smoke on her face. Say one more word before I finish examining that bruise on Elspeth Danner's skull, and I'll say mine in a room with a judge in it. Pike's eyes dropped to the documents. Hand those over, Doctor. No. Corbin looked from one adult to the next, then down at Caleb's hands, skin blistering where the gloves had charred away. Mr. Rowan, I've got an order for appearance at first light. Judge moved the hearing up on account of weather. If you fail it, the children go county. Caleb got to his feet in stages, pain climbing with him. I'll be there. Corbin nodded toward the bandages already half out of Ada's bag. See that you are. Then lower, so only Caleb and Ada heard. And hide those papers better than a rabbit this time. That night the storm locked the valley down. Snow pressed against the window panes and muffled the world until the cabin seemed to float in white silence. Ada wrapped Caleb's hands while he sat at the table, trying not to show what each touch cost. Burn ointment smelled of lard and pine tar. Beneath it rose the cleaner, sharper smell of singed flesh. Lucy and Ben had finally slept, one on either side of him on the pallet, as if exhaustion had overruled fear by force. You saved Wade, Tully, Ada said, not looking up from the bandage. Yes. Why? Caleb stared at the lamp chimney, where soot had begun to bloom. Because if I leave a man to burn when I can reach him, I become something I won't abide. Ada tied off the last wrap with neat, brutal fingers. That answer is either very fine or very foolish. Usually both. She sat back. In the softened light, and with the starch gone from her collar, she looked suddenly less like the town's unflinching doctor and more like a tired woman whose bones had memorized the shape of duty. There was a boy, she said, so quietly he thought for a second he had imagined it. You know that part. What folks leave out is this. He had croup before dawn. I heard it. I knew the sound. But a rider had come in the night for Mrs. Hodges up on Miller Ridge. First baby, turned wrong. My husband said go. He said the boy had had that bark before and come through it. By the time I rode home, Mrs. Hodges had a daughter and I had no son. Caleb did not move. I have spent 12 years having people decide whether I was noble or selfish, she went on. Neither judgment changed the empty room. The stove gave a slow settling sigh. Caleb flexed what remained of feeling in his palms and lost. May started labor early. I was in Pike's barn setting winter shoes on 6 head for his drive south. Weather already mean. She sent word once. I sent back I'd be an hour. We needed the money. By the time I got home, the midwife had got stuck at the creek crossing. May bled out before daylight. The baby never breathed. He swallowed. I have told myself every version of that story except the plain one. I chose a man's horses before I chose my wife. Ada set the roll of bandage down and rested her forearms on the table. The pose was unguarded enough to feel intimate. Some griefs never leave the house. They just learn to sit quiet beside you. He looked at her then, and the room altered again, not with fire or fear this time, but with recognition so exact it hurt worse. A soft knock sounded at the back door. Corbin, cheeks red with cold, brought Wade Tully in under one arm. The foreman's leg had been splinted rough, and shame hung on him heavier than the blanket over his shoulders. He would not meet Caleb's eyes. He asked for Rowan, Corbin said. Said it ought to be tonight. Wade dug inside his coat and brought out a black account ledger, corners damp with snow. Pike keeps copies in the office, he muttered. This is the ranch book. Names, figures, every man he's pressed. I thought you'd want the whole thing. Caleb looked at it a long moment. In that book sat more than Harlan Pike's lies. It held the weak spots of half the valley, every bad harvest covered by credit, every widow's extension, every father's late payment on seed. A vengeful man could have lit Juniper Bend with it and called the fire justice. Open to the Danner page, Caleb said. Wade frowned. You could finish him with all of it. I said the Danner page. Corbin's eyes lifted from the ledger to Caleb's bandaged hands and stayed there. Ada said nothing. She only watched. Wade found the page. Caleb nodded once. Corbin tore it free. Caleb pushed the ledger back across the table with both wrapped palms, awkward and slow. Take the rest home, he said. Whatever he's done with other men belongs to them to answer, not me. Wade stared as if mercy from the injured made less sense than punishment. He took the book and limped out without another word. If you felt the room go still there, felt the heat of that small choice more than any fight or blaze, then you know why people come back to stories like this. Leave a like if you want more of that kind of truth, and subscribe if you're hungry for tales that remember quiet goodness still counts for something. The world gets loud enough. A story ought to know when to lean closer. Morning came blue and bitter. The storm had passed, but the air after it had that dangerous clean edge that split lips and froze breath and beards. Caleb wore his best coat because the hearing was as close to church as Juniper Bend's justice ever got. Ada drove. He could not hold reins. Lucy and Ben sat between them on the wagon seat, scrubbed and solemn, Lucy with the rabbit mended at the seam, the papers tucked this time into Ada's leather case. The hearing room above the mercantile smelled of wool, ink, and wet leather. Judge Markham Sims sat behind a scarred table, trying to look larger than his caution. Harlan Pike stood near the window in a black coat that fit too well to have been made in town. Mrs. Nettle was there. Reverend Sloane. Corbin by the stove. 3 ranch wives with flowers still on their sleeves. 2 freighters. More people than the law required and fewer than gossip wanted. Juniper Bend had come to see which way power bent today. Pike opened smooth. Elspeth Danner had died in distress. The children required stable provision. Caleb Rowan was a solitary tradesman under debt pressure, physically unfit after his recent injuries, prone to reckless conduct as evidenced by the fire at Willow Flat, and lacking any established household for young children. Pike, by contrast, possessed means, livestock, and standing, and could arrange placement at once in a reputable institution or with kin farther east once located. He spoke as if he were discussing winter feed, regrettable but necessary. Judge Sims turned to Caleb. You contest. Caleb rose, hands wrapped white against the dark of his coat. I do. On what ground? On the ground those children are no man's property. On the ground their mother named me. On the ground Pike is lying about the land. A murmur moved through the room and settled. Ada testified first. She described the bruise on Elspeth's temple, the frost damage, the children's condition on arrival, the grass marks at Lucy's wrist and Ben's sleeve. She did not embellish. She did not need to. Truth in her mouth came out stripped to the studs and was harder to argue with than outrage ever was. Then she handed over the note, the patent receipt, and the paid store ledger. Sims examined each one, his thumb lingering on the seal. Pike smiled faintly. A receipt proves 1 bill paid, not the full account. It proves you lied under affidavit, Ada said. Pike spread his hands. Or my clerk erred. Then perhaps your foreman erred as well, Corbin said from the stove. All heads turned. Wade Tully, pale and hollow-eyed, hobbled in on a crutch made from a cut sapling. He took the stand without being asked twice, which told every person in that room how afraid he was of his own conscience. His voice shook only at the beginning. Mr. Pike sent me and 2 hands to fetch Mrs. Danner back from the road and recover a toy from the children. Said papers were hidden in it. Said the widow had no right carrying off what settled a debt. Wade swallowed. We caught up at the lower rise. I grabbed her. She struck and ran. I followed her part way. Snow came harder. I turned back. He looked at the floorboards. He saw her by the creek later. We all did. Sims leaned forward. And you left her there? Wade's face collapsed inward in a way Caleb knew he would carry the rest of his life. Yes, sir. Pike's composure cracked at last. You drunken fool. You think they'll believe a ranch hand over me? No, Wade said, with a kind of ruined calm now. I think they'll believe the child when she says you frightened her mother, the doctor when she says the woman was struck, The papers when they say the debt was paid, and the burn on Rowan's hands when they hear he dragged me out of a house he could have left me in. That last part did what evidence alone could not. Not because it excused anything, because everyone in Juniper Bend knew exactly how many men would have made the other choice and slept easily after. Sims removed his spectacles and wiped them on a handkerchief while he thought. No one spoke. Below them in the store, someone dropped a sack of beans. The thud came up through the floor like a heartbeat. When the judge set the spectacles back on, he did not look at Pike first. He looked at Lucy and Ben. "Your mother walked to the right gate," he said. "Then to the room. I find Harlan Pike's claim on Willow Flat unsupported and compromised by false statement. The Danner children retain full heir interest in that property. Temporary guardianship is awarded to Caleb Rowan pending formal adoption if he wishes to seek it. Mr. Pike is barred from contact or claim upon the minors or the Danner land absent court review." Pike stepped forward, color rising under his collar. "You cannot mean to put those children with a blacksmith in a two-room cabin." Sims's gaze sharpened in a way that suggested he had perhaps been waiting years to use it on the man. "I mean to put them with the only person in this matter who has yet acted without trying to profit by it." The room let out its breath all at once. Pike turned then, maybe to make one last appeal to standing, maybe to remind the town he still held notes and water and favor. What met him was not open rebellion. It was worse. Mrs. Nettle looking past him. Reverend Sloane folding his hands and not moving to his side. Corbin standing straighter. Two ranch wives with their mouths set. The first fraying of power is rarely dramatic. It is simply the moment people stop arranging their faces around your importance. He put on his gloves very carefully. "This valley will regret indulging sentiment over order," he said. No one answered. Afterward, outside in the raw bright cold, business resolved itself in the plain practical ways that make a victory real. Mrs. Nettle pressed flour and sugar on Ada as if prescriptions had changed their category. Corbin said the bank had heard enough of Pike's affidavit problem to reconsider the speed of Caleb's note call. Reverend Sloane offered the churchmen to raise a proper third room on Caleb's place come thaw, if he'd allow it. Wade Tully, still gray with pain, asked if there might one day be work at the forge when his leg healed. Caleb told him there might be, if he came sober and early. Lucy took this all in with the grave attention of a child learning whether the world had truly altered or only paused to pretend. Ben leaned against Caleb's coat and stared at the judge's door until Pike emerged and crossed the street alone. The rancher did not look over. He mounted and rode west. Snow flashed under the horse's hooves. By spring he still had land, still had cattle, still had his fine coat. But men began reading his receipts closer, and wives began asking questions over supper, and the creek crossing he had meant to seize at Willow Flat never became his. Sometimes that is justice enough. Not a thunderclap. A long turning away. Ada stayed that evening for supper and the next evening because Lucy's cough had not entirely broken and because nobody quite said she ought to leave. A week later, she was still coming and going between surgery and cabin with the comfortable friction of someone who had quit asking whether she belonged in a place and started moving as if belonging were built by use. She showed Caleb how to hold a spoon in bandaged hands. He showed Ben how to listen at the forge door and tell hot iron from cold by the color of the dark around it. Lucy followed Ada with a wooden pencil and copied the names of things onto scraps of wrapping paper until the table filled with crooked words and the air smelled of ink, broth, soap, and coal smoke. In March, when the first thaw loosened the yard into black mud and the creek began speaking again under the ice, Caleb hitched the wagon and took the children to Willow Flat. The Danner cabin was a black rib cage in the grass, collapsed inward where the roof had fallen. Ada came too. They buried a tin box of Elspeth's few saved things beside the cottonwoods, a thimble, a wedding ribbon, Martin's pocket knife, the bent sewing needle from the note. Lucy placed the rabbit on top for one long minute, then took it back. Ben stood with both fists jammed in his pockets and said nothing until they turned to go. "She found the gate," he said. Caleb looked at him. "Ma found it," the boy repeated, as if this mattered more than all the court papers and signatures in the world. "Yes," Caleb said. "She did. By summer, the third room was up. It smelled of cut pine and fresh plaster, and Lucy declared it belonged to the morning because the window caught sun first. Ada planted sage and calendula behind the surgery and onions behind Caleb's shed and never entirely moved either place into the other, which seemed to suit them all. She did not make speeches about the future. Neither did he. But one evening Caleb came in from the forge to find her mending Ben's cuff at his table with her spectacles low on her nose and Lucy asleep with her head in Ada's lap. And the sight struck him with such plain force that he had to set his hand against the door jamb before stepping in. He went to the shelf then, opened the cedar box he had not touched since winter, and took out the only thing left in it besides May's wedding comb, a tiny silver harness bell he had bought years ago for a baby who never drew breath. He laid it on the table near Ada's elbow. She looked at it, then at him. No explanation passed between them. None was needed. She threaded a blue ribbon through its loop and tied it to the rabbit's neck for Lucy before the child woke. The adoption went through in August under a sky so bright it made squint lines of everybody's eyes. Sims signed. Ada signed. Caleb signed with the stiffness still left by the burns. Lucy traced the first letter of Rowan with her finger afterward on the dry ink, careful not to smear it. Ben asked whether his wooden horse needed a new brand now. Caleb said no. A good horse kept its old miles and took the new road too. Years later, people in Juniper Bend would tell the story various ways. Some swore the key moment had been the fire. Others said it was the courtroom. Mrs. Nettle maintained to the end that the true hinge of it all had been when Ada Greer marched into Caleb Rowan's cabin, took one look at his empty flower bin, and decided that house would not remain a man's excuse for grief. Stories do that. They choose their own angle after the hurt is over. What remained unchanged was this. Lucy grew into a girl who read every label, ledger, and land notice that came within arm's reach and corrected adults gently when they got names or figures wrong. Ben grew long-limbed and quiet like Caleb, with a way of standing near skittish colts that made them settle without seeming to know why. Ada laughed more, though never cheaply. Caleb spoke no more than he had before, but the silences around him changed breed. They were no longer the cold kind. On the first good snow of the next winter, a soft one that laid itself along the fence rails instead of attacking them, Caleb came in from the forge carrying the smell of iron and horse and wood smoke on his coat. Ada was at the table trimming lamp wicks. Lucy was reading aloud in fits and starts while Ben carved at a stick with his tongue caught in the corner of his mouth. The rabbit with the blue ribbon bell hung from a peg by the stove, and every time the door opened it gave one light, silver note. Caleb paused there with meltwater darkening the boards under his boots and looked at the 4 places set for supper, at the small socks drying by the stove, at Ada lifting her head because she knew his step before she saw him. And he understood at last that the thing he had been building all year was not the room, or the note payments, or even the trust in 2 children's faces when they reached for him. It was simpler than that and stronger. Home is the place that remembers your footsteps. Outside, snow drifted easy past the window while the forge light and the lamplight joined on the glass and held all 4 shadows there. Next time, I'll tell you about the widow who bought a dying cavalry horse for $3 and found a soldier's last promise stitched inside the saddle lining. Until then, keep a place warm for someone, and good night.